Well, grit is this positive trait that consists of passion and perseverance. And throughout the series, we're following the storyline of husband and wife, Sarai and Abram. And through their story, there's going to be, 6 questions that emerge. And on the very surface level of these 6 questions, they're just great life and leadership questions. But if you are a Jesus follower, there is significant spiritual implications for you to how you're going to answer these 6 questions. The very first question, the question that I said don't answer yet, is will you say yes? Now, at the very end of the series, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, but don't do it yet. The second question is will you overcome? And to overcome, you must turn your back on fear and face God. The third question, will you overlook your uncertainty? And to be able to overlook your uncertainty, you must look up from your uncertainty and be certain in a God who will protect, and God who will provide, and a God who is guiding you, and a God who has a purpose for your life, and a God who provides peace in the midst of chaos. You have to look up from your uncertainty. Well, this all leads us to the fourth question. And what's interesting about this fourth question is I think this is one of the most significant out of all the questions besides question number 1. And this is probably one of the most difficult questions that you're going to have to answer. And this question, it's not going to be right on the surface on, this part of the story we're going to look at today. Actually, you're going to have to dig a little deeper to discover what this question really is. But I promise you, at the core issue within Abram and Sarai is how they answered this question. Well, one of the tension points throughout the story, the entire story of Abram and Sarai, and if you've been following along throughout this entire series, or maybe you're familiar of this story yourself, you'll know the tension point. But if this is your first time stepping in, first time ever hearing this story, first time connecting with us for a long time, what you have to understand is what creates so much tension is what God has promised to Abram and Sarai, and a real life moment that a lot of people have faced over the course of time. You see, the conversation between God and Abram has sounded like this. God said to Abram, "You'll be a great nation." And Abram said, "I'm kidless." Hey, God, to become a great nation, I got to have kids to be a nation. God said, "Hey, your name will be great." And Abram said, "Hey, God, I'm kidless. For my name not just to be great, just for my name to carry on, I must at least have a child." God said, "Hey, your kids will fill the land." And Abram's like, "Hey, God, by the way, I'm kidless. To fill the land, I got to have kids to fill that land." God said, "Hey, your kids will be as countless as the stars." And Abram said, "Hey, God, I'm kidless." And God gets as specific as saying, "Hey, you will have a son." And Abram said, "Hey, God, I'm kidless." And here's what I know for some of you, you really understand the tension, the emotional struggle of the desire to have a family and can't. I mean, for my wife and I, that was part of our storyline, the desire to have a family, to have a child and not being able to. And for those of you that are finding yourself in that journey right now, you know, there's nothing like the desire to have a child call you mom or call you dad and not being able to. You see, we got to step into Abram and Sarai's story. I mean, they're longing to be mom and dad, their desire to have a family, the emotions that get attached to this journey, and they're just getting older and older and older. They see that window all but shut. And in this part of their story that we're going to look at today, all of that emotion, all of that tension, all of that real life comes to a head. And the author of Genesis tells us that Sarai, who's Abram's wife, had borne him no children. Again, we're back there again. And then the author writes the word but. And if you've never heard of the story before, or read this story, here's what we all know. I mean, what comes after but usually isn't good. I mean, this story it takes place thousands and thousands of years ago, but here's what we know in our modern day. You know, what comes next usually, probably, isn't that positive. And so what we're told is, but Sarai had this Egyptian slave named Hagar. Now, this is where the storyline starts to tie in. If you remember back to part 1 of this series, we looked at this moment where God was showing Abram the promised land, the land that he was going to give them. And all of a sudden, famine hits that land. And Abram, instead of following God, Abram just takes life into his own hands and makes the decision to leave the land God was showing him and go into Egypt. And not only go into Egypt, then to sell off his wife or give his wife away as his sister to Pharaoh. And when that happened, Pharaoh paid handsomely for his wives. And Abram got a whole bunch of livestock from that. And more than likely, most scholars believe that, he got some slaves. And Hagar happened to be one of those slaves. And the word slave is actually better translated as maidservant. So Hagar worked directly for Sarai. And so Sarai gets this idea. And so Sarai says, hey, the Lord kept me from having children. Hey, Abram, God is keeping me from having kids, which means you can't have kids. And so what are we to do? Now, there's 2 very important insights we have to pull from this one statement. The second insight will carry us throughout the rest of the story, but we can't overlook this first insight. Because you think about what Sarai is saying, right? She's making a really bold and emphatic statement. And what she's doing is, something we all have done before, and maybe you're doing now. You see, we all twist God's words to fit the narrative that we are scripting. I mean, God was scripting one story for Abram and Sarai. It was God's story, and God was being very clear to them. But guess what? Abram and Sarai, they had a different storyline that they wanted to script. They had a different storyline that they were focused on. They had a different storyline that they wanted to see, and their storyline was different than God's storyline. And so what did they start to do? Sarai started to twist God's words, and we all do this. And I know that doesn't feel good, but we have to recognize a fact that God is scripting the storyline. He's scripting the storyline for you. And usually, more times than not, that storyline looks different than what you would script. So the question is, do you trust that God's storyline is better than the storyline you are scripting? Because when you take the pad of paper and pen out of God's hand and you start to write your own story, what you will start doing is start twisting God's words. And that's what Sarai did. She said, hey, God's kept me from having a kid. Hey, Abram, come on. God is keeping us. And all of a sudden, a new page with a new storyline is being scripted. And Sarai feels justified because now she is writing her own story. And where does that lead? Where does that lead for your life? When you start scripting your own story and twisting God's word to fit your narrative. We all know where that leads. It always leads to a mess. And this is where it starts to lead for Sarai and Abram. But like I mentioned, there's 2 insights that we have to pull from this one statement. The first insight, again, Sarai starts scripting her own storyline, twisting God's word. But the second insight, and do you see it in there? I mean, look at the statement. The Lord has kept me from having children. The Lord has kept me. What is she doing? Come on, you see it. It's something we all do. this begins what I'm simply titling the blame list. And who is she blaming? God. God's kept me. It's God's fault. God's doing this. So let me ask you a not real comfortable question. Well, what are you blaming God for right now in your life? What are you blaming God for? What is it that you're just, again, twisting a narrative to fit your storyline, not God's storyline? And in doing so, you're blaming God. What are you blaming God for right now? And Sarai starts to blame God. And, she goes to Abram and she says, hey, Abram, go sleep with my slave, Hagar. Perhaps I can build a family through her. Now, don't get lost in this whole marriage moment between a wife saying to her husband, go sleep with my slave, because it'd be easy to miss the real point and focus on that. Because that feels so odd for us, right? In our modern day and age, right, just the thought of a wife going to her husband to say, hey, go sleep with my, just the word slave in our modern day, right? It creates so much tension, rightfully so. But we would never think of suggesting to a husband or wife to go sleep with someone else. Like, that's absurd. So what we have to understand is thousands of years ago, this was a commonplace action, especially for a husband and wife that couldn't have kids and they would have slaves, that this would be another way to start a family. In our modern days, there's many different ways that we could start a family. If you can't have biological kids, there's so many different ways to medically achieve that, or in different ways to achieve that through adoption, foster care. There's so many different ways. So don't get lost on that, because that was commonplace. What you need to focus on is the three words she said right in the middle of all of this. It's perhaps I can build. Perhaps I can build. Hey, it started with blaming God. Now she's saying, hey, it's God's fault. He's kept me. But hey, Abram, I can do this myself. I can build a family for us. I can do something about it. Well, then, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Abram said yes. The author of Genesis tells us that they had been living in Canaan 10 years, and Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. Now, I think this is real. It's easy to point out all of Abram's and Sarai's faults, which they have many, just like you and me. But one of those intensifying realities is that, it'd been 10 years. When we're first introduced with Sarai and Abram was 75 years old. He's getting older in his age, and they still couldn't have kids. And now it's been another 10 years of them faithfully following God, them faithfully moving through the land that God was showing them faithfully saying, okay, God, you are our provider, you are our protector. Faithfully, not getting it all right, not getting it perfect, right? But they were faithfully following God, and it's been 10 years. So you could understand just Sarai as a wife, as a woman desiring to be a mom, right? You could understand, like, this tension is real. 10 years. Let me ask you, what are you waiting on God for? Are you waiting on God? You see, I think some of the most intense components of my faith journey and your faith journey is in the waiting. And here's what I've discovered. And what I've discovered is no different than countless stories throughout the Bible. What I've discovered is that my timing and God's timing rarely line up. And what I've discovered is in a deepening, growing, expanding faith, Like you got to. You got to stand in the place and go at the pace in which God is leading you. Just maybe, you're tired of the waiting. And that was for Sarai. She was tired of the waiting, but just maybe that was exactly the place and the pace that God was scripting for them, because God understood what he was doing. And just maybe where you are right now, in God's waiting, is exactly the place he needs you to be and the pace he needs you to go at. And maybe that pace is so slow. But lean into God's place and God's pace. Don't take the pen out of his hand and script your storyline. Don't twist his place and his pace to fit your narrative. God's plan for your life and God's purpose in your life is perfect. It's perfect. But for Sarai and Abram, the waiting, the place, and the pace. Remember, Sarai had already started to twist God's words. Sarai had already taken the pen out of God's hand to script her own storyline. Abram had already taken the pen out of God's hand to script their own storyline. And so the author tells us that Abram slept with Hagar and she conceived. And this is where the story gets really, really messy. When Sarai, knew that Hagar, was pregnant, what did Sarai do? She began to despise her. So now we got to add to our blame list. So let's add Hagar. So now Sarai, who sets up this entire situation, Sarai, who comes up with all of it, Hagar, who didn't have a choice, is now being blamed for it. But Sarai doesn't just blame Hagar. She turns her attention on Abram, and she goes, hey, husband, you are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. So now we have to add Abram to the blame list, because it must be his fault. And then Sarai goes, may the Lord judge between you and me. Now God, who wasn't even part of any of this plan, God, who said, okay, fine, Sarai. You want to script your own narrative? You want to script your own story? You want to take matters into your own hands? Fine, Sarah, go for it. I mean, and God does that. God allows us just to kind of go on our own path. But now Sarai's pulling God, saying, hey, you're now in between me and my husband. And God has to be scratching his head, going like, what are you doing? Well, then Abram, he blames his wife. He goes, your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. Isn't that amazing? The blame that goes around on decisions that both Abram and Sarai made. And then the author of Genesis tells us that Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. See, what we can't miss is the blame game. The blame game always ends the same way. It always ends the same way. It makes a mess out of your life. The trail of destruction, relational destruction, is massive. The hurt, the betrayal, it always ends the same way. For some of you, you just keep on blaming everyone for decisions you've made. You're blaming God for decisions you made. You're blaming a spouse, a former spouse for decisions you made. You're blaming an employer and another employer for decisions you've made. You're blaming a friend. You're blaming a financial advisor. You're blaming a whole list of people for your current situation when in all reality, you got to own it. Whatever percentage is yours to own 100%. If it's 22%, own 100% of that 22%. If it's 98%, own 100% of that 98% that you own. But today, start owning your life decisions. Stop blaming God. Stop blaming friendships. Stop blaming a spouse. Stop blaming a boss. Stop blaming your employees. Stop blaming. Start owning. It's so easy to blame everyone else. In all reality, you need to start looking at your choices, your life, and the storyline you're scripting. And just maybe, you need to take the pen from your hand and hand it back to God. The blame game always ends the same way unless you start to own it and own your percentage with 100%. Well, like the author of Genesis tells us, Hagar flees for her life, and this actually enters into such an incredible part of the story. Even in the midst of hurt and even in the midst of pain, God does something so incredible. You see, the angel of the Lord finds Hagar. Hagar's running for her life. She did nothing wrong. She had no decision-making ability in this entire narrative that Abram and Sarai decided to script. She's running for her life. And where does God go? God goes after Hagar. Again, God is a God who meets you where you are, and there's no length he won't go to find you. And God goes and he finds Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that is beside the road to Shur. And God says to this angel, to Hagar, he says, "Hey, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" And she goes, "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. And the angel said, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." Now think about this moment. Hagar is running for her life. Sarai's been so evil and mean and hateful towards her. God shows up, finds her. And what does God say? No, you got to go back. Like I said, God's storyline, God's place and his pace is rarely our pace and our place. I'm pretty sure Hagar could think of 8 million other places to be other than going back to Sarai, who was so mean to her. But God said, "Hey, Hagar, you need to go back and submit to her. You need to go back." And the angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." And the name Ishmael literally means God hears. The angel goes on and describes his son, that he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. Like I said, when we take the pen out of God's hand and we start scripting our own narrative, the trail of destruction, the trail of relational brokenness, gets everywhere. And this is just a glimpse. I mean, God didn't want this. But remember Abram and Sarai. They decided that their storyline was better than God's. But then God, as he is with Hagar, does what God does best. He redeems moments. He heals broken people. And in this conversation, Hagar, who's just in shambles, well, this is what happens. Hagar gives this name to God. She goes, "You are the God who sees me, for I have now seen the one who sees me." Hagar, a slave from Egypt that was just worth a piece of property, where no one saw value in her. No one treated her as a princess of the God Most High. No one gave her an ounce of care or love because she was a pawn in their lives. And all of a sudden, in this moment of complete brokenness, in this moment where she was fleeing for her life, in this moment where she had no clue what was going to come next, all of a sudden God meets her right there. And she goes, "Oh God, you see me. You see who I really am. God, in all of my brokenness, in all my fear, in all my loneliness, God, you see me." You see, this entire story leads us, well, to this question. And we get this question and the impact of this question through, well, both storylines, Hagar's and Sarai's. And you can't exclude Abram because Abram agreed with Sarai. You see, for Abram and Sarai, they knew what God's promises were. Over and over again, God promised, God promised, God promised, God promised. And what did Abram and Sarai do? They twisted God's words. They took the pen from his hand and they started to script their own narrative. But what did Hagar do? You see, when God came to Hagar and said, "Hey, submit, go back to Sarai," you know what she did? She went back. She went back and gave birth to a son for Abram. And Abram named the boy Ishmael. Abram listened to Sarai for the name. See, Hagar actually followed God's pace and place. You see, the underlying question that we see in this story, the underlying question that you have to answer is simply this: will you relinquish control? Or will you take that pen out of God's hand? Will you take the storyline that God is scripting for your life and think that you can script a better story for yourself? Will you look at God and say, "God, your pace and your place isn't what I think is best for my life," and just take it away? And here's the thing, God will let you do it. The question is, will you relinquish control to realize that God sees you, that God sees. God sees who you are. God sees a plan and a purpose for you. God sees how he's gifted you and wired you. And God sees your hurt, and God sees your loneliness, and God sees your brokenness, and God sees your fear, and God sees your uncertainty, and God sees. But he has a plan for you. Will you relinquish control. Hand over the pen that you're trying to script your own story with and say, hey, God, at your pace and in your place, I will go. Hey, God, the place you have me and the place you're leading me is the best place. And God, your timing, your pace, I relinquish control. So you can't. When you look up and know that God sees you for exactly who he created you to be. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you for that moment with Hagar and you, where you went and found her, and not only did you find her, you looked right at her. You valued her. You elevated her. You loved her. And Lord, I pray that every single person knows that you see them and you value them. Because you are a God that sees. In your name I pray. Amen.